Hi everyone, my name's Andrew. I'm an engineer here at Lyft. I'm here to share a little bit about how the engineering culture at Lyft has really been crafted to value front-end web performance. Not just something that we give lip service to, but something we actually follow through on. But to understand how a culture change like that can happen, we need to go back to the past. And we need to go visit some West African, Liberian tailors. Then we got to go visit some customer service representatives from Xerox Corporation in the 2000s before we can come back full circle here as knowledge workers, creative workers here in the 21st century. So let's check it out. In 1977, anthropologist Jean Lave was visiting West Africa. She was in the city of Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, and she was embedded as an anthropologist, somebody who observed human cultures through kind of embedded observation. She embedded herself in a long street in the town called Taylor's Alley. Now, Taylor's Alley was basically a street full of tailor shops. And in these tailor shops, you would find a master tailor, basically the person that would be running the shop. And then you'd find a couple of apprentices, folks who were either starting their journeys or their careers as tailors at various stages in their development. And what Jean Lave hoped to accomplish was understand the process of teaching and learning. She was there to study how apprenticeships worked in that area of the world. And if you and I take a step back and think about how we think about apprenticeships, you might imagine, like some old world, cobbler passing off his knowledge to his young apprentice through teaching or something like that, right? So she expected to find master tailors kind of teaching and guiding their young apprentices through the craft of, tailoring, cutting cloth, sewing on buttons or sewing zippers and things like that. But to her surprise, what she actually found was more of a interwoven community of apprentices teaching each other in relationship to each other, and much less the kind of interactions where, your teacher would come over to you and teach you something and give you a lesson. And what Jean Lave took away from that and published in her paper was kind of this emerging idea of the relationships or the process of embodied learning, what she called situated learning, is actually the very way of learning. Learning isn't just an abstract thing that you do at your desk at home with a lecture, but learning is the embodied practice of doing it with other people in real life. And this is, the idea of apprenticeship is pretty common today, and it's seeing a resurgence actually in our fields. So hold on to that thought. Jean Lave took this experience from her research in the 70s, and in the 90s, she and her research partner, Etienne Wenger, applied this to the domain of organizational behavior. And they wrote a book called Situated Learning. And in Situated Learning, they talked a lot about the process of learning while in the context of doing. So, the most practical takeaway for the layman would be, we should, think about apprenticeship, based learning as a thing. But they also brought together this concept of communities of practice. That's when the term first emerged. And they connected in this book the community of practice to many different spheres of everyday life. He pointed out, hey, this is how learning is happening. But most importantly, they actually drew that conclusion to organizational behavior and research. In 2000, the Harvard Business Review published a case study on the customer service representatives at Xerox Corporation. And so in their research division, their anthropologists studied the behaviors of their customer service agents as they were on the field visiting customers, trying to fix copiers. And you might imagine that when a customer service agent goes on the field and visits a customer, and the copier is broken, all the customer service agent would have to do is look up the error code or something like that, and then do the fix in the manual. But as it turns out, the real world is really messy. And so what ends up having to happen is these customer service reps usually have to debug their way to some sort of solution that's not documented anywhere. And due to the operating chaos of the real world, humidity and temperature and all that other stuff, they'd eventually come to some sort of conclusion, and then they'd spread that knowledge in among their peers through these oral networks. And the way that these Xerox anthropologists figured it out was they observed these customer service representatives going to breakfast with each other. They'd go out to breakfast before the day started. They'd grab a coffee or some breakfast, and then they just swap stories. They just connect and laugh over a shared story, and then they trade tips. They'd learn about, hey, here's how to operate this machine, through some procedure that was not documented, right? And so there was this informal kind of learning network that propagated itself through breakfast. And so Xerox did a very smart move. They actually consolidated this information into a database, into a centralized document. And you might be thinking, whatever, they made a wiki, big deal. And actually, if you and I think about wikis at work, we know that they're places where information goes to die, right? They're rarely kept up to date, and people are just whatever about them. But Xerox did a really smart move, and they actually empowered and allowed their line level customer service representatives to determine the best ways to publish this information. And so out of that emerged this community of customer service representatives that ended up organizing that information. They would vet it. They would have these committees that would, vote on and edit and then decide what articles to publish. And there was this informal way of vetting information that came together because these practitioners, the people that had to solve problems in the field, they were the ones blessing and improving the process. And so a lot of this communities of practice thinking and talk has actually made its way to modern day, creative work, agile kind of ways of working. And the term communities of practice is actually relatively prevalent. So if you think about, many of us may be familiar with what has been hailed as the Spotify model of organizations. And the Spotify model is just a theoretical framework. It's not as complicated as it is to be. You can Google it if you want. But in the Spotify model, teams work on different lines, on product teams, and they're executing in small pods. But actually, a group of folks who share the same skills can actually gather and discuss skills-related topics. So even though they're spread out among the company, working in their own product areas, maybe one's working on a user-facing product, and others working on a financial system or whatever, but people sharing the same skills, like front-end engineers, can actually get together and talk about front-end related skills, even though they're not organizationally related anywhere in the company. And so in modern day terms, a community of practice can directly apply to the modern day software organization, where most likely many of us are split up into product streams, and we need to be pulled out of our product streams into specialized groups that help us learn or advance a certain topic. Lyft went through a few phases of rapid growth and change. And as you kind of go through these phases of change, you kind of find that the organization becomes a different animal at each stage of growth. And as new teams come on, as new services spin up, the amount of work required to synchronize everyone, make them all care about the same things is very large. There's a large activation energy in order to get people to care about things. And a lot of those efforts, to kind of get lost in the noise as people just want to ship. Now, no one's sitting up at the top, with a large stick saying, "Hey, make your apps faster. Everyone has to be 30% faster by the end of the quarter," or something like that. Top-down mandates like those just aren't going to work, and also they're not fair either. And so, because web performance is one of those ambiguous, fuzzy things that we all know we should do, we do to some amount and some extent, but in the end, it remains amorphous, hard to define, and oftentimes is just not something that we tend to care about. So we wanted to make a dent in this problem. We wanted to actually make this something that people should care about, but without necessarily being really heavy-handed about it. And so we set out on building a community of practice. And we called this new group that we were forming, we called it the Frontend Performance Force, or the Frontend Performance Task Force, but the former sounded cooler. And here's how we did it. So this started from a few organic conversations between some engineers. Hey, I know we can do better. Hey, what if we, had X, Y, or Z? Hey, we should get together and do something. So the first thing is we found our allies. We found folks that we knew cared about the same things, and we banded together. Then we wrote a charter. We said the purpose of this group, and we wrote out what was important to us. We want to advance the state or the art or the craft of front-end performance. We want to make it visible. And we also made it pretty clear that our community was focused on learning and practice and a little bit less on output. Our group wasn't going to sign up for big projects necessarily and have to be on the hook for them, because we were asking people to get together to kind of donate their time. So we have to tap into intrinsic motivations. People want to be involved because they want to learn, they want to master their craft, or they want to be known as domain experts or subject matter experts or something like that, and so you have to kind of tap into those motivations and lean into those things. We started small. If you walked into one of our meetings, the first meeting looks very much like a meeting today. So what we do is we have bi-weekly meetings. That's once every 2 weeks. And during every meeting, we have 3 roles, 2 or 3 roles. The first role is the facilitator, somebody who runs the meeting, makes sure it's going on track and moves conversations along. The second role is somebody who's a note taker, who literally just writes down the things we talk about for posterity. And the third person is kind of a project manager, or somebody who kind of follows up with the open work streams that we have in progress. And every quarter or so, we rotate these roles among the group. Now, one thing that we really emphasize heavily is that there is a low barrier to entry. There's no gatekeeping involved. Everybody is welcome to join, so long as you contribute in some way to the group. And one way that we ask our members to contribute is to present on a topic of their choice, a performance-related topic. And what we emphasize very heavily is, hey, we want you to learn by presenting. Oftentimes we get in our minds this idea that, hey, in order to be the presenter, I've got to be this deep domain expert with 10 years experience in this field. No. In fact, what we emphasize, we actually ask folks who are, college grads to be like, hey, give a talk on, this technology. And we say, go learn it and come back to the group and tell us what you learned. And so we've had great talks on everything from next generation React to modern build tools to a deep dive into how our build system interacts with Webpack and Rollup and stuff like that. And these are all just from people just saying, hey, I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to go find out. And then I'll come back to the group and tell you. So we learn by presenting. Another thing we do is we record everything for posterity. So even though it's important for us to, be on the same screen at the same time for our virtual meeting, it's also very important for us to record the meeting so that anybody who's interested, right, in seeing the recorded artifact can go back and reference it. On top of that, this also enters our our catalog, our big library of content, and we get to link to it, at the end of the quarter when we send back out an email documenting all the things that we went over and celebrating all of our wins. Now, I said that we focused mainly on learning and practice. And generally speaking, that's mostly what we do. We talk a lot about emerging technologies. We share about what we've learned. Somebody runs an experiment with a new framework and shares their learnings, or spreads an idea to other people that then implement that practice. But we do have some longer running projects that actually have delivered output that's been really valuable to the company. Here's a few examples. In the course, of running this group, we've developed tools like a internal Lighthouse runner. It tracks many of our web pages, and it keeps long historical data on how the pages perform according to their Lighthouse scores. And this is really valuable because then our teams can kind of hook alarms and metrics up to these numbers and be alerted or alarmed, or keep themselves accountable to page performance. Another tool that we've been developing is a bundle size reporter. When people commit things or open a PR and they inadvertently introduce a package that perhaps bloats the bundle, the bundle size reporter reports back on, makes a comment in GitHub saying, hey, you've added 30 kilobytes to the bundle size. Are you sure you know what you're doing? And this kind of helps keeps us accountable to inadvertent bundle bloat. We do things like we also created a Core Web Vitals plugin that automatically plugs into our build system platform. And then we also, on the other side, we have these both real-time and kind of aggregate roll-up metrics dashboards. And our engineers can sign up for, weekly reports so they can see week over week performance of their tools, in Slack or in their email. So we do have output, and sometimes these projects take multiple months to execute, multiple quarters to execute. And so there do tend to be some longer running projects. And quite frankly, these are really hard to execute because a community of practice is really donating their time. So this is all running on donated time. And because it's running on donated time, a challenge that we've run across is, how do you keep a project alive when, the people working on it just have to be heads down in, their actual teams. So that's a problem we haven't necessarily solved, but our folks are passionate about making it happen. Building tools is probably the biggest lever for us to affect cultural change outwardly to the rest of the organization. Because we can build tools that that automatically get pulled into CI, or because we have tools that automatically email teams when page performance regresses and stuff like that, that actually brings up the visibility of web performance into the natural software development lifecycle for most engineers. And so building tools has been one of the most effective levers that we have. One more lever that we have a documentation portal. So remember that story about the customer service representatives at Xerox PARC, who had all these great learnings and they assembled them and put them into documented form. We have the same equivalent. We have things like case studies. Our case studies are real wins or real experiments that we've run, and we ask people to actually write down their performance wins. Hey, I tried this new library. It gave us X%, improved metrics down funnel for so-and-so flow, and we write it down. The reason why we write it down is because our case studies are meant to be linked to and shared when we want to quantify or document the benefits of web performance. If we don't do this, then sometimes it's hard to justify the benefit of web performance. And so it always helps, especially in those of us in, more data-driven organizations, to always have some sort of proof of work that, hey, doing this thing actually drives impact. On the other hand, there actually are some case studies where doing the best practice doesn't actually drive impact. And sometimes those are actually appropriate to link as well, because we want to actually document what the best practice is for our specific team at our specific point in time. We also document a few other things like tutorials. We help you get started. For newcomers or new hires who are new to the system, we want them to be able to onboard and learn the landscape of our tooling. And then we'll also have things like guides on how to set service level indicators for service level objectives, or SLOs. Those are things that we also integrate into our front end system, and so we want to help guide people set those up. One more important thing. This community of practice is time bound. So this means that this community of practice actually is not meant to last forever. And we make that very clear from the beginning. We say, hey, every quarter, we're going to elect to run for 1 quarter. And at the end of the quarter, we schedule to wind down. Unless enough of us, raise our hands and say, hey, I want to keep it going. Then we pick it up the next quarter. Doing that actually built in a guarantee that everyone involved for that quarter is bought in. If the organizers or people are feeling kind of burned out, like it, then this gives you an easy way to say, hey, I think I'm oversubscribed this current quarter. I think I can't commit this quarter. And then if enough of people say, hey, I can't really do it this quarter, then the group winds down. And maybe in the future it picks up again. But the whole point is that we don't overburden ourselves to keep the group running just because we have to keep it running. Communities of practice are meant to be organic and self-sustaining as long as they're necessary. And when they're not necessary anymore, or if it's not the right season for it, it's totally okay to wind down. Maybe you're sitting there and you think, oh, there's a gap at my company that I'd really love to fill. It could be web performance. Maybe we want more people to pay attention there. It could be things like unit testing or testing in general. I want to level up the test thinking or test like methodologies at my company. Maybe it's I want to increase people's understanding of the craft of software development or people management or whatever it might be for you. When we looked at the librarian tailors, we learned from them that learning happens in the act of doing, in the act of moving together as a embodied community. That was the process of learning. And so it is with us as we're engineers moving together in the act of working together on teams. And then when we looked at our Xerox field technicians, we also learned from them that knowledge is created organically. Knowledge is created through connection. And sometimes that's the most authentic, genuine, trustable source of information and change. And so I recommend starting small and looking for somebody else. Find one other person in your company who's feeling the same way you do. It's easy to feel alone sometimes. You think, oh man, like, does nobody else see this gap the same way I do? My guess is probably not. There's probably somebody else out there who's also thinking the same thing. And they want to increase or accelerate, the development of this capability or this insight in your company. See if you can find them. Send out a Slack message with some feelers. Put together a small, a brown bag lunch, share an article and see how people respond. You'll find your people. Go find your people. At Lyft, we did end up finding our people and formalizing a group out of it, which did in the end also have the blessing of, support staff and management and stuff like that. However, one thing that we can also learn is that a lot of this movement doesn't have to happen with top-down mandate. It all happens bottom-up. It organically emerges. And that's the beauty of this whole thing. You don't have to wait for your manager to give you the okay. You can just do it yourself. You don't have to wait for somebody to say, oh, our OKRs, our KR for this quarter is performance. You can just go and find your people and start talking about what it would look like to create a culture where performance is built in from day one. And see where it goes, right? Start small. And once you start building more momentum, I guarantee you that people will notice. Then you can kind of talk about how to move it forward as an organization from there on. So I'm hoping this is resonating with a lot of you today in the audience. Would love to keep these conversations going in the conference Slack. And on behalf of my team at Lyft, we want to thank you for inviting us here to speak at CascadiaJS. We hope you have a great conference. Can't wait to keep the conversation going. Thank you very much.
All right, and we are back. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was very interesting because a lot of us think about internal cultures and internal communities at work and how to build them. There were a number of questions about finding time to do this work. Is it reasonable to expect them to have code output when they're busy doing their day jobs? How do you manage your time while you're documenting? Do you have some comments on that?
Yeah, totally. First of all, thanks for inviting me here for everyone in the conference. So I talked a lot about like what it takes to, like do all this stuff, like you're sustaining all this energy outside of quote unquote like your day job, right? So here's a few things I suggest. Number one, like make sure your manager knows what you're doing. Like once again, like I said, you don't need your manager's approval, but also like you should inform like folks about what you're doing. So your manager can run cover for you. Oftentimes the things you're doing, they're oftentimes things that, need to be done anyways, or like things that your manager can get behind, and they can kind of run cover for you, maybe reserve some time for you. So for myself, like what I do is I actually tell my manager, hey, I'm helping lead this group. I'm going to need to carve out, a couple hours every other week to keep it going. And then the group kind of, because it's self-organizing, people pitch in their time from here and there. And we basically organize asynchronously over Slack or chat or like our Google Doc or something like that. So that's number one, how we maintain that energy. What was the second question?
Oh, well, both of the questions were about how people find time, but there was another question about what if I want to do something that leadership says no to?
Yeah. That's a really interesting thought experiment, right? Like, what if I'm doing something where like, oh, I want to investigate, getting us on like Svelte or something like that, right? But if the entire company's like stack is on React, and there's no way leadership would agree to that. Well, I would say like make sure your interests are truly aligned with leadership, right? So in order for you to be starting something, like make sure you're like you have a good idea of like what the company wants to do or what's important to the strategy of the team. Like things like, improving, test best practices, or, like doing a good review of our hiring practices to make sure they're accessible to everyone. Those are all things that are, generally universally good. But, like you might find yourself in a situation where somebody actually comes along and says, hey, I don't think you need to focus on that. And at that point, just take it, just kind of take it and recalibrate yourself to something else.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We're coming up on our next talk, and I want to welcome back a CascadiaJS alumnus, Aaron Turner, who was on the stage when I last emceed in 2019, and he's going to be talking to us with a talk called "Enter the Sandbox: JavaScript on WebAssembly." So take it away, Aaron.